My voice is a reflection of launching a daily news show 2 months ago. So it actually did not exist yesterday, so I'm doing better, but it may give out a couple times. As Josh alluded to, the audio efforts at the New York Times are quite new. I came in about 7 months ago, and the Times had a truly open-ended question that it had not yet begun to answer, and that was, what should the New York Times sound like? And the Times had seen the recent success of the Modern Love podcast, which was a partnership with WBUR, where I had previously worked. And they had done some research, and they believed that audio was a good opportunity for the Times. But what that meant and what form that should take was totally, totally open-ended. And so one of the first things that we started doing when I arrived was thinking about what the Times can do that no one else can in this space. And for me, I thought at first it would be narrative series, because as I was meeting with all the different desks and the sections at the Times, with foreign, with national, with enterprise, with investigations, with the magazine, I could not believe the number of incredible stories inside this organization. And having spent more than 10 years in public radio, generally speaking, you have sort of an inverse situation to that, which is you have a building that's filled with talented audio producers and editors, but you're always looking for great stories and great talent to tell the stories. And this felt like being a kid in a candy store as we were going around with all these meetings. You have 1,100 of the best journalists in the world doing the best journalism. And the challenge is instead to build an infrastructure to tell great stories, to tell those great stories in audio, to support those great journalists. And once you've done that, you can pretty much take your pick of the biggest and the best stories out there. And so narrative felt like it allowed, to me, it felt like that's the thing. It lets you get the closest to doing justice to those types of stories. Sort of like documentary and video. That's a form that makes sense to the Times in a sort of intuitive way that it's doing justice to the level of quality going into the journalism. But the problem is that there's too much journalism at the Times. And narrative series are incredibly labor intensive. They take months to make, and incredible stories are being told, and world-class journalism is being done every day inside of the Times. And so how do you tap into that? And maybe daily news seems like the obvious answer to you, but it didn't seem like it to me, because having worked in a daily newsroom, there's a reason no one had launched a daily news show on demand yet. And that is that it takes a ton of resources and infrastructure, which we didn't have. We were the opposite. We were a startup. And two, because daily news does solve the volume problem, the tons and tons of great journalism, but it doesn't, typically by necessity of making a show every day, solve the quality problem. And so the breakthrough for us in the form of the daily was a new form of daily news, which we're calling narrative news. It's daily news that doesn't just capture the volume of journalism being done, but also the quality, or at least we like to think so. 1 or 2 stories a day told by journalists in a narrative form. And that is what we aspired to and what we tried, what we believe we launched in February with the Daily. On February 1st, we launched the Daily, 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week, hosted by Michael Barbaro and powered by New York Times journalism. And I'm going to, for the rest of this presentation, to show you a few examples of what it means to be powered by New York Times journalism on a daily news show. I think they show these examples not just why the New York Times newsroom turns out to be uniquely positioned to make this show, which it does, but even more importantly, why this show is actually now showing us that it's uniquely positioned to transform the way that people are now interacting with the Times. And so I'm going to start. This is an example of a recent story. Maggie Haberman and Glenn Thrush, our White House reporters, recently had a sit-down interview in the Oval Office with President Trump. And in principle, the interview was supposed to be about infrastructure. It went in a lot of different directions. But if you look at this, this is a pretty straight-ahead account written by Maggie and Glenn of the interview. It shows that they do have great access. That comes through. But I think mostly I'm expected to sort of just understand that as a reader. Compare that to Maggie and Glenn coming on to the Daily the following morning to talk about that. And they had brought in, to their great credit, they had brought a recorder into the Oval Office specifically for the Daily, and they had recorded the interview. Glenn Thrush then sat down with Michael and talked about the experience, and it was woven through with audio of the interview as it happened. And I'll just play a very short sample of that. Susan Rice was in the news at the time, and so this refers to some claims that President Trump was making about that.
We went in, Maggie and I, for what was billed as a wide-ranging discussion of his infrastructure plans, and boom!
I think the Susan Rice thing is a massive story.
We couldn't get a word out before he started hitting on Susan Rice.
I think it's a massive, massive story all over the world. I mean, other than the New York Times.
We've written about it twice.
Huh?
We've written about it twice.
Yeah, it's a bigger story than you know. I think.
You mean there's more information that we're not aware of?
I think it's going to be the biggest story.
Why? I mean, what do you think?
What else?
Take a look at what's happening. I mean, first of all, her performance was horrible yesterday on television, even though she was interviewed by Hillary Clinton's PR person, Andrea Mitchell. Of course, you've been accused of that also, so, you know.
Mostly by you, though.
No. Mostly by a lot of people.
So I think that's just an incredibly different relationship to that interview. The access could not be clear. The interplay, these reporters clearly have a relationship with the president. The authority, you think you might have an idea of what it's like to interview the president. And for me, at least, hearing this, no, I didn't know it was this. I didn't know that they were fact-checking in real time. They were interrupting him. They were holding him accountable for the things he was saying as he said them. That's, you know, I don't think a short clip can fully demonstrate that, but it gives you a sense of that. And also, there's just some serious transparency behind that, a sense of, I know what it looks like for two reporters to go into the White House and interview the president, and I have a very clear sense of what they were up to. And the feedback on that interview was that it gave people a whole new level of respect for these reporters who President Trump, you know, every day is going on Twitter to directly attack these two people. And then I think it really challenges your understanding of what that relationship is to hear that. Next example I'm going to give is of a reporter, Rukmini Callimachi, who's sort of the leading terrorism expert, terrorism reporter. She reports on ISIS. This is a recent story on the ground in Mosul. And I wanted to show this because if you read this story, you get a sense, it does a great job of reporting what's going on. It gives you a lot of information that you need, a lot of important information and context. It does not give you the sense that Rukmini is there. It does not give you the sense that Rukmini is sort of one of a kind in her understanding of her beat. It does not give you an on-the-ground sense of what she's up to, or even, honestly, the fact that she's there at all. Erbil is in the Dateline, but I think most readers that doesn't mean much to them. Just because it says you're there doesn't really mean to most readers that they are in fact there, or give them an understanding of what that would mean to be there. This is Rukmini talking on the Daily about the idea that, just trying to think of how best to set this up. This is her talking about there were some civilian casualties, and she's talking about how the Obama administration is seen by many to not have been forceful enough, not to have acted swiftly enough.
One example that I think really brings us to the fore is the story of Junaid Hussain.
Junaid Hussain is a 21-year-old hacker turned jihadist from Birmingham who runs the IS information and recruitment arm from Syria.
He's linked to numerous foiled attacks in America and beyond.
Known as Abu Hussain, he has been identified by the United States Secret Service as a top 5 target for elimination by drone strike.
According to the reporting of our colleagues, the coalition knew where he was in Raqqa and wasn't able to take the hit for week after week because he kept on going outside in the company of his elementary school-aged stepson.
So strategy works.
Right. So he knew that if the child is with him, the coalition won't take the hit. And they finally got him on the one day he went outside without the kid.
What you just said about how ISIS believes that the U.S. won't attack a fighter, even a fighter it really values and wants to take out if a child is present.
Right.
It makes me wonder if this most recent attack, which killed so many civilians, will challenge that assumption.
Right.
And challenge it in a way that might ultimately, if perversely, benefit the United States and Iraq. Will it dispel the ISIS belief that human shields will work?
Right. Well, probably not, because look at the fallout from this incident. I mean, I think it already has changed something. We've heard that the fighting in Mosul has now been paused.
So you can hear the authority in her voice. You understand that how much of an expert she is. You understand that this is really her life is in service of reporting this beat. But you also hear her grappling with real questions about what it all means, and in a way that I think, also sort of deeply humanizes her as a reporter covering this incredibly confusing and sensitive topic. So the last example I'll give is has less to do with the reporters, although certainly that too, and more to do with a traditional source relationship. One of the unexpected and powerful benefits of the Daily has been that reporters, these 1,100 journalists all over the world, are constantly interacting with people and interviewing people for their stories. But the result of that, often in service of a daily news story, is a line or two to support a thesis. It's very unusual in a daily news format, I would say, for a source or a character to really come to life. They're used in service of illustrating a point. And one of the amazing things about working with Times journalists has been how willing they are to share those sources with the Daily and to let us speak to them or to interview them themselves in a deeper format in audio in a way that can bring an understanding to a story in audio that that's really difficult to accomplish in print, which is a truly human relationship to what's going on to the news. So in the case of this story, this is a story by Monica Davey, who is the bureau chief in the Midwest, and she went to this town in West Frankfurt where the county had voted 70% for Donald Trump, but they had really come head to head with some of the results of that when a beloved member of their town, who no one had known was an undocumented immigrant, had been detained and was could face deportation. And so Tim Grigsby is this man, Carlos, who was detained. It's his best friend, a white small business owner in this town who did vote for Donald Trump. And he's just a line in the story. We interviewed him for 45 minutes, and he became the sort of the narrative spine of the story on the Daily, along with Monica Davey, the reporter. And here he is on the Daily.
Have you written a letter yourself?
Yes, I have.
And what does it say?
He's writing a letter asking that his friend Carlos be released.
I mean, do you just want me to read the letter to you?
I mean, anything. If you think there's a passage that's important to you.
Carlos and I have done business together for over 10 years now through La Fiesta since they came to our town and built a restaurant. Throughout the years, I became best friends with a person that has made one of the biggest impressions on my life. His demeanor is a perfect example of what every person in this world should be and how they should act. His contributions are immeasurable here in Southern Illinois. He's no way in any danger to our community. He's nothing but an asset. And truthfully, if we lose him, our community is going to have a hole in it that will be very difficult to fill, if we'll ever be able to fill it.
So do you continue to support the president?
Yeah, I continue to support the president. Do I continue to support him on these immigration policies? No, I do not.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the whole thing is kind of, I don't know, more or less woke. I'm not saying woke us up, but a lot of the things that don't necessarily touch your life immediately. This actually, reached out and grabbed us and said, "Hey, this is your buddy."
So how's it going? 2.5 months in, we just hit a big number, 20 million listens, which far surpassed our expectations on this show. The show has sat at or near the top of the iTunes charts since launch. Obviously, there's some movement, but it's always up there. But more importantly, all of this that I've just talked about we're seeing transforming audiences' relationships to the Times. We have the youngest ever audience of any Times products for Times Audio, so that means that the audience listening to Times Audio is younger than any audience for any other Times product. We are getting strong evidence that this is becoming a daily habit in people's lives very quickly and very powerfully. You can see some of these texts that are directly texted to Michael Michael has you can subscribe to receive texts from him, and the texts we get back are just give us an example, an idea of how important he's become in people's lives on a daily basis very quickly. And most importantly, I think, as illustrated here, is that people's ideas of who Times journalists are, what it means to be one, and what their relationship is to those journalists is being transformed. These are really deep relationships that are being forged. They're not just bylines. And so by changing relationships to the journalists, we're changing relationships to the journalism, and ultimately, we think, to the Times. Thanks.